Didn't Paul say he's not coming today?
Paul is absent, yes.
Okay.
We start in his absence then?
Yeah, so who's planning on driving today?
I can do that. But probably Maru can take the handle of the dock, given Maru and Paul has been working on that together, I guess. Sounds good, Maru?
Yeah.
You want me to share the screen? Or you would do that?
What am I sharing? Yeah, I think you'll need to do it. My Zoom's kind of screwed up. I upgraded my OS, and Zoom doesn't want to do cameras or screen sharing right now.
What operating system would that happen to be, Maru? Let me take a wild stab.
You can guess, but I'm not sure it would be accurate. So what do you think I'm running? It's a trick question because it's curious whether you'd actually know.
I assumed Linux, but I hope that I'm wrong.
No, it actually isn't. It's OS 10.
Oh, really?
I finally got it together to upgrade to a new version. I'd been on Yosemite, and I was like, oh yeah, this is unsupported now. And now things don't work because I'm on the latest.
Uh-huh.
Reasons I don't upgrade.
So I seem to remember you guys had a document which seemed to be providing good focus for the discussion. Is that current? I assume that's what we were wanting you to share. I can share it if that helps, if I can find it. Oh, there we go.
Are you guys able to see? I have already shared that.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so last I remember, just to recap, we had a discussion around this diagram and just a loose relationship among the functional areas, and we had to go into the next sections in the document, or basically brainstorming around the specifics of the API, if there might be.
I can't even see screen sharing. Bummer. I'll just open the doc.
Okay, I mean, for reference, we were basically just into the next sections after the diagram that was a snap captured by either you guys. So the section reads brainstorming. And I posted some new comments. I saw some new comments on, I'm not sure if there are more new comments. So which can also be discussed maybe.
Yeah, I replied. I'm happy to go through anything.
Okay.
Whatever. Yeah. And I should say, I've started prototyping this, and that's not to preclude other people from doing work. Or, I mean, Quentin, you seemed pretty interested in having things move ahead, and so I'm trying to maybe build knowledge around how we're going to compose this thing and test it, that sort of stuff.
Awesome.
Point people to that. My goal is to push PRs and not just merge code. And obviously this isn't an official thing. It just gives people an opportunity to have visibility. The only PR I have up right now is just, it's trivial. Like beyond the base commits in the repo, we're just initializing via API server builder. Subsequent commits will be just like adding a secret, adding testing for this, getting integration testing working. So anybody who's interested in following along, participating, contributing, feel free. It's not really official, and I don't expect this code to be become something that we use necessarily. It's more just to make sure that we know as much as possible before we do sort of start in on things for real. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's very useful.
Cool.
Okay.
I think there were sort of two themes maybe that we wanted to do today. The one is actually dig through the details of this brainstorming on how to do templates and this and that and the next thing. And the other area was to figure out if there are more people who want to start like implementing stuff. Is there stuff that we can usefully implement? So some of the stuff you just mentioned, for example, getting some of the less contentious APIs actually implemented in an API server and getting the tests to run against them and these kind of things seem like stuff that can happen in parallel with these discussions. And we could obviously tweak those things if we change our minds on anything, but it seems like the bulk of the work could be done. So I think one of the goals, I don't know, is Paul here today?
Paul is in London. And I don't believe he'll be joining us.
Okay, no problem. But I know he was also keen to sort of like carve off pieces that we could go and get going so long while these conversations are going on. So I guess that's the other area that we should try and touch on today.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my mandate is to get to sort of a minimal, maybe the minimum thing, which would be secrets config map, replica set with placement, with overrides, with propagation. And it's not to say that what I'm coming up with is going to be by any means comprehensive. It's just like, what's the let's go as far as we can in the direction of having a solution and see what that sort of shows us. And so I'm hoping to have something like working that way, like out of the repo that I pointed to, maybe by the end of the week. And then hopefully, you know, the outcome of that, as I said, is like people can sort of see something and have a sense of, you know, what works, what doesn't, what additions, changes, whatever. So hopefully, as you say, like there can be an ongoing dialogue and the prototyping work can kind of inform that discussion.
Excellent. Yeah, that was sort of the direction that I was thinking of recommending is picking out, you know, we have a bunch of existing objects that we support in the existing system, and we have implementations of the API. Well, the API is basically nothing more than Kubernetes API plus some annotations, and we have the controllers, which are kind of bundled up versions of all of these areas of functionality that we've been discussing. So one option would be to basically go through that list in some reasonable order and convert them to what we think a reasonable shot at the new API is, given the degree of consensus we have at the moment. And then, you know, use those concrete implementations as some sort of review point and say, yes, that's broken or it's good or whatever. And then in parallel, once we've identified, I think, you know, 2 or 3 API objects that we can agree on, this is a good, you know, those ones look good and that seems like a reasonable general approach, then presumably we can accelerate and break up the remaining parts of the API because we have a, you know, a general pattern that seems to be working.
Yep, I agree with everything you say.
Cool. All right. So maybe then Maru, you, me, Shashi, and Irfan can like get together after this and figure out concretely like specific things to do in the next few weeks. And anybody else who wants to get involved in actually writing code in the next week or 2 can climb in there, and then we can use the rest of this discussion to just go through the current brainstorming in the doc and see if we can get some more agreement there. That sound decent? Reasonable?
Sounds good to me. Anybody else?
Yep, fine for me.
Okay, I'll step back and leave it to you guys. Sorry, I didn't mean to take over.
No, that's fine. I think having some sort of concrete action plan is super important.
Okay, so let's go ahead following the same order that has been listed in this doc.
Oh,
So,
actually, there is an outstanding question that Jonathan raised. I'm not sure where in the document it was. Oh, maybe it is below. So below that, for below that diagram, the first question that I think is actually really important is how we handle versioning.
Versioning, yeah.
Has everybody seen Jonathan's question?
No, maybe you can summarize the point.
I will give a link and I will summarize. Hold on.
I'll put that.
Is this one?
That's the question.
Oh, is that actually?
Yep.
Yeah. So the question was, is there a different version of federated replica set for each version of Kubernetes replica set? And I hadn't thought about this at all. And my answer was basically like the existing way that like federation works is it maps one-to-one with Kubernetes types. So if you were to have a new Kubernetes type, you would automatically get a new federation type. But where we're using this sort of templating idea, I think we're going to have like a version of federated replica set for every version of the Kubernetes resource because the template will be typed. This is going in action. And I think this is fine. The only sort of weird thing about this that I was thinking about was that if I had an alpha, like if I'm starting off creating a new federated replica set, the initial version should probably be alpha because I haven't finalized a propagation mechanism or how it's going to behave scheduling wise, that sort of stuff. But I mean, it's already apps v1 in Kubernetes. And so I would suggest that we would have like alpha 1 would target apps v1, beta 1 would also target apps v1, and v1 would also target apps v1 because that's the stable version. Does that make sense? So there's the federation version would always be less than or equal, and hopefully we're converging on equal. Does that make sense? This is kind of a funny topic. I'm hoping that it's coming through.
Yeah, I had a similar discussion in my own head recently about similar stuff, and I came to roughly the same conclusion. I guess the only caveat is that, in theory, all later Kubernetes versions are backwards compatible in the sense that you can, for a given, maybe I'm about to talk garbage. I was going to say, if you don't know, if you're a Kubernetes client and you don't know about subsequent versions of an object, you can just send your old version to the same API server and everything works fine. So in that sense, so I guess the version is, yeah, you got to distinguish between versions of Kubernetes control plane and versions of the API. And my understanding is that the control plane supports older versions of the API for quite some time into the future.
It does. Like, it's not so much a compatibility issue that we're addressing here. It's more if I am creating a federated replica set and like the fields that are available in the template will be dependent on the API version, like of the Kubernetes object that I'm targeting. So if it's an older version, it may not include fields that the user wants to use.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I guess that begs the question as to whether the Federation API needs to provide the same backwards compatibility. So a given installation of Federation, would it support, V1 replica set templates and V2 replica set templates at the same time? Do the appropriate mappings.
I think so. Go ahead.
I think the same analogy which the replica set to pods can be used, like both of them. For example, in Kubernetes, if you try to use an older version of replica sets, which probably has been upgraded to V1 right now, you would still be targeting to the latest version of pods. And you wouldn't specify the API version at all in the template. So we can probably do the same thing, and what Maru you're suggesting seems okay in that case. So the federated objects version would progress from probably alpha to something stable, whereas the K8s API would be the latest most, or whichever is the most stable right now. Some object might be beta, or some object might be V1 in that case.
Yeah.
But hold on, I think you might have just contradicted what I said. So maybe we should just be clear.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is in Kubernetes right now, if you create a replica set v2, you automatically get a node v2 or
A
whatever.
pod v2.
Sorry.
Not the pod v2. Whatever is the latest stable version of pod. You
Okay,
don't
so
specify the version of pod in there, I guess.
it's
I mean,
implicit
somebody
the
correct me if
version
I'm wrong with this.
Okay. And if you create a replica set v1, you implicitly get some or other non-explicitly specified version of the node,
Yes.
sorry, of the pod
Yes.
temp.
Yes. So yeah. So the correct way of saying that might be, let this not be explicit. Let this not be something which is specified in the template. It should be something which the API inherently, or the implementation of the API inherently decides.
Oh, so we have a point. We should just do some research and see how Replica handles its templating of the pod, because it occurs to me that like,
Okay.
as long as we have backwards compatibility, my concern was more I was thinking of like, how do we represent this to the user if they want to use a specific version of like, say, a replica set? What version do, I don't know, maybe it's not a good question. I guess so I'll just say like, I'll take it as an action item to go look at how pods does this, because I'm like, well, can you actually change the type of the field between versions? But maybe that's okay because there's backwards compatibility implied in the pod like spec. Anyway, I'll figure that out. But Jonathan, I'm sorry for you initiated this conversation. Do you have any thoughts?
I didn't have any thoughts when I asked the question. I sort of saw that, and given our previous experience with federation and versioning, I figured it was worth at least mentioning when I saw it encoded here in the template. I guess one thing that does come to mind is that if you have this progression of a federated resource from, say, alpha to beta to V1, I wonder if so now the federation resource is at V1, that means you can't necessarily make any changes to it until the underlying Kubernetes resource also has changes.
No, I don't think that's
No.
true.
Yeah. The fields in the fields relevant to the federation object can change, right?
But you said you can't rev the version of the federation object. Mura said we wouldn't rev the version of the federation object above the version of the underlying Kubernetes object.
I'm gonna check that. That's what I have to investigate.
Okay.
I think, somewhat irrespective of what Kubernetes does right now, I think that the template version and the federated object version are independent of each other, or they are.
Correct.
They're different version numbers. So version 27 of a federated replica set may implicitly may imply version 2 of the replica set template. And then we might rev the federation version, as many times as we like to change the placement options and whatever else is in that wrapper without replica sets changing during that period. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that made sense to me. It just seemed like what Maru had been saying before was keeping the versions in more of like having the version of that the federation object would never have a higher version than the underlying object. Maybe I just misunderstood, but no, that makes sense.
That was my sort of thinking off the cuff. And when I'm thinking about it, I think what Quentin's saying makes more sense, that like there doesn't actually have to be a relationship. I was kind of concerned that if the user wanted a specific API version of a Kubernetes resource to be propagated, they would have to like have some sort of matrix to figure out which API version do I have to use. But in practice, that's probably not a problem. And I guess the thing that I was ignoring was, for a given federation version, there will probably be like a minimum supported Kubernetes version, and whatever API version is current in that minimum supported, like that's going to be at least what you're going to get, like in terms of what template version.
That makes sense.
Okay. Okay. I will make a point to add a section that summarizes that in this doc. Cool.
Okay, makes sense.
Thank you, Jonathan, for raising that. And
No
thanks
problem.
for sorting it out, because yeah, my initial impression was clearly not well thought through.
Uh, and I don't think anybody has questions in terms of the naming of the API, like the pattern that has been described in the talk. It seems unanimous to me.
And we can always vary it. I mean, this is just
Yeah.
like, do we have something to work with?
Okay. Okay. I had a little bit of, I mean, I did write something, some thoughts on placement. I saw some comment raised by Torin about the policy related stuff, which was raised. Where is it? Yeah, here. So what I could um, sum up was that placement that we are specifying as a functional area, it seems fine to me. Whereas when I tried thinking about deriving an API for the placement, I was a little confused. So, for example, if you read the comment that I did put out, um, so implementation wise, we have a couple of options. We could have a more simple approach where just like services versus the endpoints, labels are matched, and that way we can just match labels, and resources and clusters which have the same labels, resources go to that cluster. You could have some midway approach, which is implemented in cluster selector, currently in Federation, or you could have a full-fledged policy-based implementation, which actually sort of integrated into today's Federation using OPA and admission controllers. And there is some overlap of placement with scheduling also. So I had two questions on this. So
What's OPA?
one,
Open policy
OPA
agent.
is an open policy agent, which is another open source project, which there is some integration hook provided in the current implementation of Federation to have policy-based placements.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so and placement also has some overlap with scheduling. So, uh, uh, to me, I have two questions. One was that do we really need another resource for placement? Can we do, for a start, can we just do a simple label-based mapping, and that ensures that placement happens, mapping those labels from clusters to resources? Uh, Probably the answer to that is we might define placement right now, or Maru, you can answer.
I have a couple thoughts about that first question.
Mhm.
I think that the reason for separating things out is allowing us to experiment. So we can have implementation that does it via selection, or one that does directly via object references, or something else. One of the rationales, like that was the initial rationale for separating it out. But then thinking about, like Torin commented, like how does this integrate with policy? And I think if I'd really like to have like him participate in a discussion. I'm hoping to. I should have asked him to try to show up for this if he could, but we'll try to get him like in a future meeting, either Federation or Federation working group, or like multi-cluster. Anyway, just to have his direct sort of participation. In my mind, having placement as a separate resource has the advantage of allowing policy to be enforced. The current annotation-based mechanism, you could enforce it if you had an admission controller that said you can't change these fields under these circumstances. But if you had, I mean, it's difficult to do that in a configurable way, like in an annotation-based mechanism. If you have a resource like Federation placement or something like that, you could potentially have RBAC rules that said you can't change rules, you can't change this. So policy could actually be enforced by some sort of policy engine. It could be set via placement resource, and then you'd only have privileged users being able to modify that. Does that make sense? So that, to me, it's like having a separate resource, just to summarize, having a separate resource allows us to like reuse Kubernetes like ACL mechanism, which is RBAC. And if it's all in the same object, then you have to jump through hoops to be able to protect like on a field basis. And I think that may be trickier.
I think I don't object to the idea of separating these things out, but my kind of interest is actually from a different point of view. I think in practice, if you look at the current mechanism, I mean, it does actually achieve what you're suggesting in that you have these policy objects which you specify and have their own set of RBAC rules. And then you have admission controllers, and those enforce, so if the update, for example, to the preferences comes from the user and not from the policy engine, then they just can get rejected. And conversely, on the way through, if there are changes to the object, then the policy engine can enforce whatever policy it has. So I don't think there's a million-mile gap between what you're wanting and what the current mechanism provides. What the current mechanism doesn't provide is the ability to share placement across multiple objects, which I think is quite a common user requirement. So, and not only the actual requirement for placement, but the actual placement after scheduling. So let's say, you had a replica set and a secret and a config map or something that logically had to end up next to each other for the thing to work. Currently, you can specify the same selection criteria for all three of them, and you can say, put me in Europe, but they may not actually end up in the same zone as each other, and therefore not actually fulfill your requirements. So then you're forced to kind of give them an explicit cluster to put them all in, and things get messy. And one way of getting around that would be to have some kind of affinity rules where you say, I want my secret next to this replica set, wherever that ends up, and all of that kind of stuff. But another way of doing it is just to say that you've got a single selector, and that thing, selects to some, set of clusters, for example, and then all of the things that are tied to that selector end up in those same places. So that part of it I find quite interesting. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I think that was definitely one of the other sort of rationale for a separate resource. Just because, it doesn't tend to be that you federate single resources, you tend to federate applications. And as you say, that they probably have common placement criteria.
Yeah, I actually did give this a thought. So the benefit of specifying placement as a single resource is that you don't have to apply explicit labels on all the different resources which you might miss or whichever way. That was the one benefit which I could think of. Apart from that, I couldn't conceive how exactly if we end up specifying policy like fields or specification inside the placement object, we might be going the wrong way. That is what I was concerned about.
I'm not really sure how policy. I guess my view is educated by the existing implementation, and I'm not sure if that was kind of the end goal or if it was just a stepping stone to some future iteration. But it seemed like there was admin-defined policy, and then that policy was applied to resources. And so I'm not sure when you're talking about actually having policy directives on the resources themselves, is there any precedent for that, or can you describe what you mean?
No, what I meant was something like this. I've highlighted it, where we specify some constructs which are very specific to the placement spec or whatever, which is a string, not into region, or then we might say greater than these values or smaller than, which is more like not a generic scenario.
Why do you say that's not a generic scenario? That's it's the precedent for this is node selection. And I'm pretty sure that that's sort of the mechanism that was put in place for cluster selection, at least in the existing implementation.
You mean node selection?
Well, like there's node selection in Kubernetes, and then when I was looking at the code that implemented cluster selection, it closely mirrored what node selection
Yes.
it allowed.
Yes. Yeah.
Why is
Okay.
there both a resource selector and a cluster selector? Or how are those different?
A resource selector is determining which resources the placement applies to, and then the cluster selector determines which clusters those resources should be propagated to. So it's kind of like a many-to-many relationship.
Where now I'm confused as well. So I think your description of resource selector described the.
This is also a label, Quinton. So this label can select multiple resources of different types, not a specific type.
Yes, I
and,
understand. But selecting the resources in the federation control plane, not in the clusters. Is that
correct? Correct. This is strictly, it's basically directives for propagation.
Okay, so maybe the example country equals US is not the best one. So maybe
Another example.
because
yeah,
that's
maybe an
sounds like
app
it's
name or
to-
something could be
Yeah,
specified. Yeah.
application name, I think would be a better example.
What was that, Jonathan?
I think like Irfan just said, an application name or something would be a better example.
Yeah, or whatever phase equals test or something. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So the answer to this question probably is that it makes sense to keep this as a separate object, and it is an easier way of specifying the same thing. But we are not going to probably do more than what is specified here currently.
Well, so maybe before we consider that to be a final decision, I mean, I do have some reservations about separating these things out. You end up with synchronization problems where, what happens if you specify and maybe there are good answers to them. If you specify the placement directive before there are any things that match it, then I guess nothing happens. And if you specify something afterward, if you specify something that doesn't have a matching placement, it presumably doesn't get scheduled. Maybe both of those are fine. And if you update either of them, I guess the controller has to kind of watch both of them and make sure that if either of them changes, it potentially re-triggers propagation. So maybe those are not actually major concerns.
I mean, the goal isn't saying this is what we're doing. It's more like thinking about what potential, like just kind of here's a solution space, here's potential solutions. I'm not saying this is what we do. I'm just going to try this path and we'll see how I like it, people like it, how well it works. And if it doesn't work, we can iterate. Yeah,
and on the flip side, I mean, if everyone in this room agrees that this is the best way to do it, we should just make that as a tentative decision and say that's what we're going to do, unless somebody comes up with good reasons not to. I'm quite keen for us to get to some sort of decisions sooner rather than later. So
I just want to.
off the top of my head, I can't think of any good reasons not to consider that to be the right way to do it. Does anybody else disagree with that?
I guess I'm not entirely sure why we always want them separate. Like, it seems like for simpler cases or like some users, it would be less config and less overhead to just have the placement and the override just next to each other. Like, here's this, I want it in this cluster with this value.
Yeah, I think that's a valid argument.
One thing to note, Greg, is that in practice, if users are doing these as YAML files, they can still put the federation placement and the federation overrides and the object next to each other separated in that one YAML file. It's not exactly maybe not quite as integrated of an experience, but a user could make one YAML file that contains all of the federation relevant objects for one object they're trying to federate.
Okay.
I think that assumes that you're using, kube control and YAML files. I think there are many other ways. I mean, if you're using the API more generally, and if you're using something like a GUI, you don't usually get that luxury. So
Well, I think that's a good point, Quinton. I would say back that I think people who are using the Kubernetes API or writing a custom controller are unlikely to be the sort of people who are going to want the very simple user experience. I expect that the people who want the simplest experience will tend to be using sort of the basic Kubernetes tools or a GUI. And in the context of a GUI, the representation of this can be much more integrated than the actual object being created. This has the flexibility for you to make a GUI that is very simple and yet still have the flexibility of the objects underneath it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay.
I mean, this has kind of gone through a couple iterations, and previously, like I thought, well, maybe there should be a field on the resource. You could either have like a local selector, or you could have a reference to a placement resource, and it would be exclusive. You pick one or the other. But I mean, I think we can always add that capability. Like as long as something is additive, it's relatively easy to add it. It's more like
We can use an annotation. I'm just kidding.
Well,
Yeah, I think that all sounds like reasonable arguments to me, I must say. One other thought that this triggers, which I'll just put out there for the moment, is that, you know, if we make a similar argument for all the rest of the federation stuff, placement and templating and whatever else, and we push them all out, then all that ends up in the federated replica set or federated whatever it is just the template, in which case it kind of looks like the Kubernetes thing. In which case, I wonder if we shouldn't just call it that.
but it's
basically what we do is we push all what we have as annotations now, we just push all those out into separate objects that have label selectors that attach them to the template thing. I don't know, just a thinking ahead. Maybe that isn't where we end up, but.
I think that's kind of where we're at. I think the value in having separate resources is then we can, especially if they're type agnostic, like as long as we don't have to do like placement, like replica set placement, you know, deployment placement, or replica set override, deployment override. By having things be agnostic and use selectors or some other like type agnostic mechanism for like relating them, to me, it's just easier to experiment with. I'm not saying this is what we end up with, but it means that if we want to vary the implementation of one of these mechanisms, we only have to change the implementation. We don't have to go back and affect all, like for each type, we have to actually create separate support and modify it over time. This to me is a far more experiment-friendly way to do it. I'm not saying it's the end goal though.
I can foresee some challenges with the generic placement approach, in that there are already enough cases where we have type-specific choices. I mean, one off the top of my head that I can, so weighting, for example, is something that only applies to things that have weights. So, you know, weighting secrets or config maps doesn't really make any sense. And it gets much more complex than that, where if you have like a deployment across multiple clusters, that has a whole bunch of configuration around how do you want the rollouts to happen? Do you want them per cluster or in parallel or in serial and blah, 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 all of which make relatively little sense with all the other. Well, actually, maybe in retrospect, maybe that's.
Did I say, I got it wrong on overrides? I think I was only talking about placement, because overrides do imply typing, as you say. And as far as the scheduling goes, I mean, the example at the end of the document, it is typed. Because as you say, doesn't make sense to have a type agnostic scheduling preference. It's very specific to what you're scheduling.
Okay, and you did actually not say placement. You said something else, and
I said overrides. Yeah,
I heard the wrong thing.
My bad.
Okay, maybe we just carry on, and if those things become a problem, I'll mention.
Yeah, all I wanted to point out was just having placement be type agnostic is. It'll make things easier to prototype. I'm not saying we end up there. That's all.
Yeah, this argument of placement being type agnostic also sounds pretty sane to me, as keeping it as a separate object. Okay. And whatever specific section or specific, or for example, weights can be specific to the scheduling type of that particular object. but yeah, it'll be good to know what exactly goes into the federated object spec. Right now, I see nothing over there. Okay, so
So
any
wait,
other?
just to harp on this even more. So if these federation placements are all going to be type agnostic, don't they effectively just become federated selectors? And what we talk about in terms of weighting, that's covered under propagation.
No, propagation is just putting things in clusters. There's no overriding or sizing or anything going on. It's just getting the stuff into the cluster.
Yeah, I would think weighting would be part of the override section, because that's a cluster-specific difference for each object. Whereas placement is saying this object should go in this cluster and not go in this other cluster. Because I think Maru had an example before where, say, you can have a replica set that has 0 replicas and yet is still propagated to a cluster. So simply saying this has a weight of 0 doesn't imply that it shouldn't be propagated. And if you choose to make that implication, that is sort of above and beyond the already existing specification of thinking the overrides affect what the objects are going to look like if you were to put them into each cluster, and the propagate or the placement affects which clusters you're going to put the objects into.
I think that example works, except that I don't know how valuable that distinction is, but.
I think I agree that the distinction is not very useful when it comes to replica sets, but there is, I mean, I think there still is, I think there are potentially more valuable examples, and at the very least that one is straightforward enough to understand and to see why why there is a difference between a 0 weight and not propagating or not placing the object in a cluster. Perhaps we can find a better example, but I still think it's conceptually, it makes a lot of sense to me conceptually to keep those two things separate and to not elide them accidentally or intentionally, at least for now.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. If someone can think up of a better example. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just thinking you could potentially implement something like that as a federation placement selector that's some sort of special, I mean, you could add more details to the selector, like if the object has, if a replica set has no replicas in it, then don't propagate it. That could be part of the placement spec.
No, I think that is where we are overriding on, overlapping with the scheduling portion of it.
But, I mean, there's going to be overlap here, but the reason there's overlap is I think we want to at least test out like having these things work in isolation. Whether or not it's, you know, it solves people's problems is another thing, but for somebody who just wants to worry about placement and isn't going to vary things across clusters, maybe they don't need overrides. For someone who, you know, just wants things going everywhere but wants to vary things by cluster, maybe they don't need placement. Like, and same thing with scheduling. Maybe you want to define some things with overrides, but have others defined automatically via, you know, the member cluster state. So there's definitely overlap. It's just a conceptual breakdown that I think is useful for discussing it and thinking about it.
And something Quentin brought up before, the idea of just the idea of a GUI. I think one of the things useful, and I think somebody else has brought up before, kind of the idea that the Kubernetes APIs are quite low level. And in a lot of cases, people might be thinking of things at a higher level. And if the expectation is that at some point people will be interacting with a federation, not so much via creating federation placement resources, but through some user interface, I think there's potential that it makes it easier to design a user interface if the conceptual building blocks are straightforward and don't have odd interactions. It's easier to mix that together in a user interface than it is in a user interface to try and tease things apart that are mixed up, that are combined in the representations underlying it.
Yeah, I guess the caveat is what Greg mentioned a bit earlier, which, you know, if the majority of your use cases are the simple one, forcing your users to have to go through something, or even your API or your GUI designers to go through something more complicated just to cater for the potentially more complicated use cases might not always be the right idea. But I think we're heading, personally, I think we're heading in the right direction here with the decomposition, and I don't have any major reservations so far.
I think maybe one of the examples that I have in mind was I found my introduction to Kubernetes to be fairly difficult in the sense where you'd have a deployment and where if you only wanted to pass a specific configuration, you also had to deal with volumes and config maps. And you're already talking about at least 2 resources and a stanza in a pod spec that is more complicated than it potentially should be. So I don't think the barrier is that high to having 2 separate resources.
Yeah, I agree.
Plus, I think we had some discussion around keeping the federated object as a parallel object or a separate object than the Kubernetes object in federation control plane, rather than having the Kubernetes object as templated inside. This, to me, seems like we are deriving towards the other approach where we have parallel federated spec for each Kubernetes object. So Kubernetes object is just wrapped under a federation object which has nothing else, and everything else is described and defined inside other objects.
I think the goal of that is in making sure there's a distinction between a federated, I'm just calling it a template at this point. Like a federated template is defining something, the basis for which you're going to propagate to multiple clusters. And anyway, sorry, I'm confused. Are you suggesting that maybe why are we doing this versus just having the Kubernetes object, or?
Yeah, because the implementation, the point that stood out over there was that the implementation of whatever the controllers or the static controllers, whichever way you are implementing it, would be more complex to have interactions between multiple objects. And if they are active controllers, they have to watch all different objects and then make decisions rather than.
I remember that. I remember the conversation talking about Irfan, and we did come to the conclusion that putting them together was better than pulling them apart at that time. And I can't, off the top of my head, remember, there seemed at the time to be fairly conclusive reasons why that was better, and we had consensus on that. Now that I'm looking at it, I'm struggling to find very conclusive examples. I mean, so a complex controller that did all of the things we anticipate would have to kind of trace this graph of all these different objects and find all the pieces that actually relate to a given, let's call it federated object, and watch all of them and respond, to changes in any of them. And if some of them got deleted,
yeah, I mean that was the reason of choosing keeping all of them in one.
So there's a good example actually. Let's say we had a placement that we call them a federation placement object, and so we created a replica set, and we created a federation placement that said put it all in all these clusters, and then somebody deleted the placement. Not the actual replica set, but just the placement. Would the controller, I mean, what would the sensible and expected behavior be? Would the controller notice that's been deleted and then delete the stuff from all the clusters?
I think there needs to be sort of expected behavior if no placement exists. And I mean, in the current model, or in the current implementation, I think if you don't have a cluster selector, you just go in all the clusters, don't you?
The default is that, yes.
So I mean, the behavior would depend on whether it was default propagate or default not propagate. And if you lost a specific placement directive, then you would just get the default, whatever that was. Whether that's configurable or not, I'm like, do we want to, is that something an administrator should be able to decide, or should there just be baked in behavior that says what it is?
And I'm not suggesting that the outcome that I speculated about is necessarily the wrong thing. I'm just saying we need to be comfortable with those things. So none of those questions really exist, or not to the same extent, in the aggregated model, if I can put it that way, where you have a single object with all of this information inside it. Because you either update that single object where it's very clear that you've changed your placement requirement for that object and now you want to put in different places, or you've deleted it, in which case you want to delete it from all the places where it was put. Whereas now it's maybe a little more gray, and I don't know, I haven't thought through all the potential failure cases.
I think you're right that there's kind of a corner case where previous presence or absence implied propagation or not in the absence of specific directives.
And then there's, if you, so maybe a more interesting one is like you change the label on something and now it no longer matches its federation placement thing. And now the controller says, well, there isn't a federation placement associated with this thing, which is true, and then deletes it from everywhere. And like, is that expected desirable behavior?
I think
Yeah, the point I wanted to voice out was that segregating these as different pieces of the API and giving the facility to maybe aggregate them all together sounds pretty nice to be done in terms of the API, and probably simple for static implementation. For example, object which is definition which is placed somewhere as a Git something, and once propagated only. But to implement dynamic controller the way it is implemented in Federation would become much more complex than probably it is right now. That is what I wanted to voice out.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm thinking of, yeah, carry on.
in your example you're giving, Quentin, I think this means you need to do like a sort of a two-phase upgrade, right? Like you prepare the placement for your changes in the object, and then you have to like do a few steps to like do it so you don't like just delete your deployment in the process.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you wanted to make changes to the placement and the spec or whatever of the thing, you either end up needing like transactions at the API level, which I don't think we have at the moment, or you end up with a sort of pretty inefficient propagation result, which is that you propagate the interim state, which you didn't really want, and then repropagate the end state. Is that sort of approximately what you were referring to?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah. Which again, I mean, the more I think about these things, I think there are solutions around all of them. So I can imagine, for example, having the concept of kind of referential integrity, where if you try and delete a federation placement and it currently matches any objects, you just like fail it. And you say, sorry, you can't do that because it's in use at the moment and you have to delete the things that are using it. Or you have like a minus force override kind of thing, which says, yes, I want to break everything. So there are a variety of solutions to some of these potential problems. And the question is whether the complexity of that is sort of warranted by the flexibility of being able to iterate on all of these things independently and yeah, those kind of things, which right now it feels like it is.
So I know the deployment has like deployment strategies where they cover at least two different ways to handle when a deployment is updated. It seems like a placement strategy that could fit in the spec here could cover one of these cases as to when the placement is updated. What is the expected outcome? Is there a recreation or a deletion or something like that?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, somewhere in the propagation configuration or something, tells it what to do when these things happen. Yeah.
Also, maybe along that, maybe somewhat similarly, I would wonder if it would be interesting to create a way, so like for kubectl authorization, for Kubernetes authorization, you can ask the API server if you're authorized to do something. I wonder if there's, what sort of similar provisions are possible to make in the Federation control plane. Is it possible to build it in such a way that you can have a way to see like, hey, if I make this change, it will spit out a propagation object, which is like, this is how your change would affect your objects in clusters. I don't know if that would be useful. It seems like if we're considering building something that has potentially different models, like a push model versus a pull model, that could fall out of this by saying I create the artifacts necessary for a pull model, but instead of putting them in the clusters or in the place where something will pull from them, I just give them back to the user in a response so he can view them.
I like that idea.
Oh, I didn't quite follow that.
Sorry, I'll say that again, Quentin. So you can imagine, so kind of in the same vein of how in the Kubernetes RBAC and authorization, you can do an API call that asks, am I authorized to do this action on this object? Like, can I list config maps? Sort of kind of introspection into what you're able to do.
Like a dry run.
A dry run in essence. So I would say, if I make this change to this placement object, what will the propagation look like? And since if we're building things in this way and considering both push-pull models, where you could have a model that instead of a controller pushing changes into the cluster, the controller creates configurations that the cluster then pulls, that could potentially be diverted into a response to the user, not to the location, not to the sort of pull location, but just to the user to see, here's what the new configurations would look like.
Would have done. Yeah, that makes sense. Now I understand you. Yeah. Sounds good.
So we only have
Okay, and
here.
yeah, say that again, please.
So we're just about out of time here, it looks like.
Yeah, and we are officially out of time also. Okay, so we'll continue the same discussion day after tomorrow. I think there already is a meeting notice for Wednesdays.
Yeah, tomorrow is multi-cluster, I think, and I won't actually be able to make it, but Federation is on Wednesday again, so we'll continue this then. Awesome.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay. And yeah, Quentin, you want to Quentin mentioned that we might sync up after this. Did you mean immediately after this meeting?
Up to you guys. I mean, I guess we can wait till Wednesday. Maybe more concrete stuff will come out of that. I want everyone to be blocked, unable to do anything until we made decisions. But it seems like we should have like stuff on Wednesday.
Yeah, it also sounds like Maru is not necessarily blocked and is going to be able to go and build things out in the repository and do some of the experimentation. And I think like this can all happen in parallel, like you've mentioned, Quentin.
Yeah.
So one sort of logistical or administrative point, these meetings, should they be included in the Kubernetes SIG multi-cluster YouTube playlist, or should there be an alternative playlist for these particular meetings?
So this one today was actually a one-off.
Okay.
The Wednesday ones are periodic, and I would say they should have their own stream or whatever you call that thing, playlist.
Okay.
Just link it out of the Federation, out of the multi-cluster group, so that if you want to follow this working group, you go to this playlist, and I'm sure over time there will be other working groups and they'll have their own playlists.
Okay, so in that case, I will, they've mostly, the ones that have been recorded, I will upload them and try and see what is necessary in order to get a Kubernetes org playlist or anything on YouTube, and also make sure that it's clear in the community repo that there's a separate list of meetings that are probably of more interest to people who are interested in Federation specifically.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool.
I'll take an action item to do that. Yeah, no problem.
Thanks for doing this, Jonathan. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.
All right.
Ciao.